Our two best sources for Norse mythology are the Prose and Poetic Eddas. Today I want to dive into one of these, the Prose Edda, by Snorri Sturlson. Yeah, I know the intro to this one's kind of boring, but first and foremost, Snorri Sturlson wasn't actually Norse. He was Icelandic, but he lived several centuries after the Norse cultures had been assimilated into the greater Christian Europe. But he had an interest in the original mythology, and even though he threw in a little bit of Jesus and fanficked in the Trojans, he did a pretty good job. So the Prose Edda starts by lifting the beginning of Genesis. In the beginning, Almighty God created heaven and earth and all that pertains to them, which is a pretty un-Norse way to start things out. But the reason he does this is because at the time, any non-Christian doctrine was largely frowned upon. So we get Snorri trying to fit Norse mythology into a Christian context. Of course, if you're combining Norse and Judeo-Christian, why don't you throw in some Greco-Roman as well? Sturlson goes on to talk about a city in the middle of the world called Troy. Troy is where all the Norse gods originate. Thor, Odin, they're just Trojans. Odin leaves Troy, travels through Asia, which is supposedly where we get the term Aesir, and goes up to Norway. This is in no way canonical with actual Norse mythology, but it's another interesting aspect of the time it was written. You see, classicism, and especially a love for Troy, because Troy is supposedly where the Romans came from, was a big deal, and kind of everyone in Europe wanted to be Trojan. Basically, any European nobility was like that teenage girl who has a dozen Paris shirts but has never actually been to France. That's a stereotype I've never actually seen replicated in real life, but whatever. The next part of the Edda is where we get the bulk of the mythology. It's where this guy Gylfi travels and talks to the three leaders of the Aesir, High, Just as High, and Third. He picks their brains for a while, mainly about the nature of things, and while they do answer him, they often do it very snidely. Then Gangleri said, "What is the path from the earth to the sky?" Then snickering, High answered, "Your question shows little knowledge." By the way, Gangleri is the false name that Gylfi gives to the Aesir. It's actually the third name he goes by in the book. The second is Gylfi, and the first one I just can't pronounce, so we're going to keep saying Gylfi, which I may still be mispronouncing. This questioning is where we get most of our information. We get the creation myth, the gods, what they do, Ragnarok. It basically lays out the mythology in a timeline. After this long conversation ends, Gylfi finds himself in a field with no sight of the Aesir or the hall he had just been in. So he goes home, and he starts to spread his new knowledge. The prologue to this section ends by reaffirming the connection to Greco-Roman myth. It says that Hector is actually Thor, and that Loki is also known as Odysseus. Same characters, different names. Once again, this isn't actually reflective of canonical Norse mythology. The next two sections of this are largely focused on poetry. This is because Snorri started out writing these as guides on how to write Old Norse poems. This is where he got the idea to write about myths, because so many of the references in Old Norse poetry were being lost. These two sections include a conversation between Bragi and Aegir, two Norse gods. They also flesh out some of the mythology and add in some new information. Altogether, the Prose Edda is a pretty entertaining read, from the Troy fanfic to the poetry slam with Bragi. And while written long after these stories originated, it offers a really interesting look into Norse mythology. I'll see you tomorrow, VEDS. May our stories outlive us all.